She arrived with nothing but a battered leather satchel and a name nobody believed was real. The moment Vivian Sterling stepped off that stagecoach, Silver Creek stopped breathing. Men who'd never looked twice at a stranger found themselves staring. Women pulled their shawls tighter. And somewhere at the edge of town, a man on horseback watched her from beneath the shadow of his hat brim, then turned his horse around and rode hard in the other direction. Nobody knew yet what she was running from. Nobody knew what she carried. But by the time winter broke over Blackstone Ranch, everything would change. The land, the people, and the cold, grieving man who swore he'd never let anyone in again. If you've ever been judged before anyone heard your story, stay with me. Hit like, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and follow along for every part. This is Vivian's story, and it starts now. The stagecoach arrived 40 minutes late, which meant the small crowd waiting outside the Silver Creek relay station had been standing in the January cold long enough to lose their patience entirely. Hector Briggs, who ran the station and had been doing so for 19 years without a single day off he could remember, stood with his arms crossed and his breath fogging in the air. Two ranch hands from the Dalton spread waited on horses nearby, neither of them speaking. A woman in a gray wool coat clutched a paper package to her chest. Everybody had somewhere to be, and not enough daylight left to get there comfortably. Then the stagecoach rounded the last bend in the road, the driver calling down to slow the horses, and the whole party lurched to attention. 3 passengers disembarked, a portly traveling salesman who immediately asked Hector where he could find a hot meal, a young man in a new suit who looked like he'd spent the whole journey reconsidering every choice that had brought him to Montana, and then her. She was the last one out. She took the metal step carefully, her left hand gripping the door frame, her right holding a leather satchel that had clearly seen a great many years and a great many miles. It was worn smooth at the corners, and the brass clasp was tarnished almost black, but it sat against her hip like something she knew how to carry. Vivian Sterling was not what Silver Creek expected. She was younger than the weight in her eyes suggested, somewhere in her late 20s. Though certain moments, certain angles, she looked older than that. She wore a dark green traveling coat with buttons replaced in slightly different shades, as though she'd mended it herself across different towns. Her hair was dark brown, pulled back practically rather than decoratively. She wasn't the kind of woman who'd been standing in front of a mirror before she stepped out. She was the kind of woman who'd been moving. She looked up at the town, the single main street, the frozen mud ruts, the general store with its paint peeling at the window frames, the saloon that was already showing light even though it wasn't yet 4 in the afternoon. And she looked at it all with the calm, measuring expression of someone who had cataloged a great many towns and wasn't easily impressed or easily frightened by any of them. Hector Briggs, because his wife had raised him with at least some manners, stepped forward and offered to take the satchel. "I've got it," she said, politely. But there was no pause before the words. "Coach from Billings?" "Through Billings, yes. Long ride." It was. She wasn't cold, exactly. She just wasn't performing warmth she didn't feel. Hector, who'd been running a relay station long enough to develop a sense for people the way a sailor develops a sense for weather, watched her scan the street again and thought, she's checking for something, or someone. He didn't say it. It wasn't his business. People came to Silver Creek for all kinds of reasons, and he'd learned a long time ago that the ones who offered their reasons first were usually the ones you trusted least. "They're a boarding house?" she asked. "Widow Farrar's, 2 streets north. Reasonable rates if you're not expecting much." "I'm not expecting much." She thanked him and walked into the town. So, she stayed at Widow Farrar's for 3 days. She ate quietly in the small dining room, spoke when spoken to, paid for her meals separately from the room rate without being asked to, and did not appear to do much beyond reading, sleeping, and occasionally walking the length of the main street with the deliberate but unhurried step of someone who was thinking rather than sightseeing. People noticed her. That was unavoidable. Silver Creek was a town of perhaps 300 people in the dead of winter, and anything unusual registered quickly. A woman traveling alone, well-spoken, clearly educated, showing up with 1 bag and no stated reason for being there. That was 3 days' worth of conversation in a town where news traveled slow. The speculation started almost immediately. She was a widow fleeing debt. She was a school teacher who'd lost her post. She was, and this came from old Clarence Dutton, who'd never in his life allowed facts to constrain his theories, a confidence woman who'd already cleaned out 2 towns in Wyoming and was working her way north. Vivian was aware of all of it and said nothing to correct any of it. The truth was she'd come to Silver Creek for one reason. Margaret Finch, a former domestic worker who'd once told Vivian, years ago in a completely different life, that Blackstone Ranch always needed good help, and that a person who knew how to cook, really cook, not just keep people from starving, could find steady work and a room that didn't have drafts and a household that, whatever else it was orderly. Margaret had passed away the previous spring. Vivian had found this out through a letter that took 4 months to reach her. But the ranch was still there. The need for a cook presumably still existed. And Silver Creek was far enough from where she'd been that she'd let herself believe, with the cautious optimism of someone who's learned to keep that particular feeling on a short leash, that she might actually be safe here. On the morning of the 4th day, she walked to the land office and asked after Blackstone Ranch. The clerk, a young man named Parsons who wore his hair parted too severely down the middle, brightened immediately. Blackstone? That's Mr. Hawthorne's spread. Biggest operation in this part of Montana. Probably 40 miles in any direction you want to count. You got business with the ranch? I'm looking for work. I was told they need a cook. Parsons looked at her in a way that was not quite rude, but was not quite respectful either. Mr. Hawthorne's ranch manager does the hiring, fellow named Bert Calloway. He comes into town Thursdays for supplies, mostly. Today is Thursday, Vivian said. It is. She thanked him and went to find Bert Calloway. He was at the feed merchant's, arguing pleasantly with the proprietor about the price of oats, when Vivian walked in. Calloway was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s with a weathered face and a neat gray mustache that he'd clearly put some effort into maintaining, despite every other aspect of his appearance suggesting he'd given up on appearances years ago. He had the look of a man who'd worked hard his entire life and was moderately at peace with that fact. He turned when she came through the door, assessed her with the blunt efficiency of someone who'd hired and fired a great many people, and said, "Help you? I heard Blackstone Ranch is looking for a cook." "Who told you that?" "Margaret Finch, some time ago. I understand she's passed." Something in his face shifted. A brief, unguarded moment. He'd liked Margaret. That was obvious. "She has," he said. "Almost a year now." "I'm sorry." "You knew her?" "We worked together briefly, a few years back. She spoke well of the ranch." Vivian paused. "My name is Vivian Sterling. I've been cooking professionally since I was 17. I can do simple meals for a full crew, or I can do something more specific for a private household. I can work with a limited pantry, or I can tell you what you're missing and why it matters. I'm not asking for anything but a conversation and a chance to demonstrate." Calloway studied her for a long moment. "Where were you before here?" "Denver most recently. Before that, a few different places." "You got references?" She'd known this was coming. She'd prepared for it the same way she prepared for everything difficult, practically, and without pretending it was going to be easy. "I have written references from 2 households in Colorado. I'd be honest with you that neither of them are from the past year. I've been traveling, and the work I did during that time was less formal." "Less formal meaning what?" "Meaning I wasn't always in a position to ask for paperwork." He was quiet. She waited because she'd learned that filling silence with more words rarely helped. "Blackstone's not an easy posting," Calloway said finally. "Mr. Hawthorne's particular. Not difficult, mind you, just particular. He's been without a proper household cook for 6 months, and the ranch hands have been rotating kitchen duty, and everybody's miserable about it. There's also the boy." "The boy?" "Mr. Hawthorne's nephew, Ethan. He's 11, been living at the ranch since his parents passed 2 years back. He's—" Calloway searched for the right word and settled on something that was clearly a careful version of the truth. "He's quiet. More quiet than a boy that age ought to be, probably." Vivian said nothing, waiting. "You'd have your own room in the main house," Calloway continued. "Meals for Mr. Hawthorne and the boy, plus a working kitchen for the bunkhouse crew. We run about 14 hands through the winter, more in summer. Thursday you'd have the morning to come to town for supplies, though you'd clear the list with me first." He paused. "Pay is $15 a month plus room and board." It wasn't lavish. She'd earned more in better times. But better times had stopped being a thing she could count on. "That's acceptable," she said. "You'll start on a trial, 2 weeks. If it works for Mr. Hawthorne, we'll make it permanent." "Understood." "One more thing," Calloway said, and his voice shifted slightly. Not unfriendly, but direct. "Mr. Hawthorne values his privacy. Whatever you see or hear at that ranch, it stays at that ranch. He's a wealthy man, and wealthy men tend to attract attention they don't want. I'd expect you to be discreet." "I'm a very discreet person," Vivian said, and meant it more thoroughly than he could have known. Blackstone Ranch was 43 miles from Silver Creek, and the ride out in Calloway's supply wagon took most of the afternoon. The landscape changed as they left the town behind, the flat, scrubby outskirts giving way to rolling country, the road climbing slightly through frozen meadows, the mountains appearing in the distance with the gradual drama of things that don't need to announce themselves. Vivian sat on the wagon bench with her satchel in her lap and watched it all and didn't say much. Calloway, for his part, seemed to appreciate that she wasn't one of those people who needed to fill every quiet with conversation. He pointed out landmarks now and then, a creek crossing that flooded badly in spring, a line of cottonwoods that marked the boundary of the Hawthorne property, a ridge where elk had been seen the previous week. "How long have you worked for Mr. Hawthorne?" she asked, somewhere in the middle of the second hour. 11 years. Came on as a ranch hand, ended up in management." He was quiet for a moment. "He's a fair employer. Not warm exactly, but fair. Pays on time, doesn't ask you to cut corners on things that matter, and if he says he's going to do something, he does it. In my experience, that's rarer than it should be." "And his wife?" Calloway's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "Mrs. Hawthorne passed 3 years ago. Fever. It was—" He stopped. "It was fast. Faster than anyone expected." Vivian nodded and didn't press it. "He hasn't been the same," Calloway said after a moment, as if he needed to say it to someone. "I don't mean that as a criticism. I just mean he used to run this place different, more energy to it. Now he manages it well, but he manages it. Do you understand what I mean?" "Yes," she said. "I do." The ranch came into view as the sun was dropping below the ridgeline, painting the sky in colors that had no business being that beautiful in January. The main house was larger than she'd expected. 2 full stories of timber and stone, with a wide front porch, several outbuildings clustered behind it, and barns beyond those that were substantial enough to be impressive even from a distance. There were lights in several windows. It looked like a place where people had once been happy. Bert Calloway introduced her to the ranch at supper time, which meant she met most of the hands at once, which was the most efficient way and also the most overwhelming. They came in from the cold in groups of 2 and 3, tracking snow across the bunkhouse floor, and they looked at her with the combined assessment of 14 men who'd been eating each other's indifferent cooking for 6 months. "This is Miss Sterling," Calloway said. "She's the new cook. Starting Monday, she's running this kitchen, so anybody who's been treating it like their own personal disaster area needs to reconsider that immediately." A few of the younger hands looked slightly guilty. Most of the older ones just looked relieved. Vivian looked at the kitchen. It was large enough, with a good cast iron range and a deep pantry, but whoever had been using it had been doing so with more enthusiasm than organization. Flour had been spilled in 3 different places and not entirely cleaned up. The knives were in a box with other implements, which explained why they were probably all dulled. The salt and pepper were in unlabeled containers sitting next to each other, which seemed like an accident waiting to happen. She didn't say any of this. She asked where the aprons were, found them hanging behind the door, put one on, and started taking inventory of what was in the pantry. By 8 o'clock, she'd produced a large pot of beef and root vegetable soup, fresh cornbread, and a pan of fried apples with cinnamon because she'd found a bushel of wrinkled winter apples in the cellar that were past their best, but not past saving if you knew what to do with them. Nothing was fancy, but everything was seasoned properly and made with attention, which turned out to be the difference between food that filled you and food that made you feel like someone had thought about you when they made it. The hands ate without much conversation, which in her experience was the highest possible compliment. A teenage hand named Cody, who couldn't have been more than 16 and still had the kind of face that showed everything he felt, leaned over to the man beside him and whispered something. The older man, weathered, missing the tip of one finger on his left hand, who'd introduced himself simply as Marsh, nodded with an expression of profound satisfaction. "Better," was all Marsh said. She took it. She met Adrian Hawthorne the following morning. She'd risen at 5:30, which was her habit, and had the kitchen fire going and coffee ready before 6, when the household normally began to stir. She was at the counter rolling out biscuit dough when she heard footsteps on the main house stairs, not the quick, light steps of the boy, which she'd already catalogued from the evening before, but deliberate, measured steps. A tall man's steps. He came into the kitchen doorway and stopped. Adrian Hawthorne was perhaps 38 or 40, though, again, like her, he had that quality of looking sometimes older than his years, and sometimes exactly his age, depending on the light. He was tall, several inches over 6 feet, with dark hair that was just starting to silver at the temples, and a face that might have been conventionally handsome once, but now had too many angles and too much tiredness in it to read as handsome in any uncomplicated way. He was already dressed, which suggested he'd been up for a while. He held a cup he'd apparently intended to fill with coffee, and then seen that there was already coffee made. He looked at the cup. He looked at the pot on the stove. He looked at her. "You're the new cook," he said. "Yes, sir. Vivian Sterling. Calloway mentioned you'd arrived." A pause. "You're up early." "I find the morning before anyone else is moving is the best time to understand a kitchen." He came in, refilled his cup. She noticed he did this himself without any expectation that she should do it for him, which was something, and stood near the window where the weak winter light was coming in. He was looking out at something, or at nothing, in the way of someone who was used to starting his mornings in private thought. "Calloway said you're on trial," he said, still looking at the window. 2 weeks, yes. He likes to do it that way. It seems reasonable. Silence for a moment. The biscuits needed to go in, so she put them in, and the oven door made a sound when she closed it that was slightly off, a small rattle, suggesting a loose hinge. And she made a note of that. "The kitchen needs some reorganization," she said. "Nothing expensive. Mostly just order. I'd like to make some changes over the first week, if that's acceptable." He turned from the window then and looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were dark, somewhat guarded, and gave nothing away easily. "What kind of changes?" "Better labeling. The knives need sharpening. I'll do that myself if you have a whetstone. The pantry needs to be organized by category rather than whatever system seems to have developed organically. I'd like to know what staples you want kept on hand at all times, and what the household's preferences are, yours and the boys." "Ethan," he said. "His name is Ethan." "Ethan," she corrected herself. He was quiet for a moment, in a way that felt like he was weighing something. "He doesn't eat breakfast most mornings. You shouldn't take it as a reflection of the food." She wasn't sure what it was a reflection of, but she sensed it wasn't something he was going to explain further, and that pressing it would be the wrong move. "I'll keep something available. In case." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but a slight easing. "That's probably good," he said. He took his coffee and left the kitchen. She stood for a moment looking at the empty doorway, then went back to the biscuits. She met Ethan Hawthorne that afternoon. She'd been expecting someone fragile-looking, given what Calloway had told her. What she hadn't been expecting was a boy who moved with such determined self-containment that he seemed to occupy his own atmosphere. He was small for 11, slight, with his uncle's dark hair and a pair of serious gray eyes that watched everything carefully before letting anything in. He came into the kitchen while she was making a stock from the beef bones she'd found in the cold cellar, and he stood in the doorway in the particular way of children who want to be noticed but refuse to announce themselves. Vivian went on with what she was doing. She didn't look at him directly. "You can come in if you want," she said after a moment. "I'm not going to put you to work." He came in a few steps. He looked at the pot on the stove, at the organized counter, at her. "You're the new cook," he said. His voice was quiet, but not weak. "That's right. What happened to the other one?" "There wasn't one. For a while, apparently. Your uncle's ranch hands have been taking turns." Ethan considered this. Cody burned everything. Marsh wasn't bad, but he only knew how to make 3 things. "What 3 things?" He thought about it. "Beans, bacon, and beans with bacon." She almost smiled, didn't quite. "Well, I know more than 3 things." He looked at the pot again. "What are you making?" Stock. It's the base for soup or gravy or a lot of other things. You start with the bones because that's where the flavor lives. Can I watch? You can. He found a stool near the counter, not right next to her, but not far. And he sat on it and watched without speaking. She worked and let him watch. After a few minutes, she asked him, without making a production of it, if he knew how to read a temperature by the sound of a simmer rather than by looking at it. He said no. She showed him. He listened with the focused, almost painfully earnest attention of a boy who had learned to be careful about what he gave his attention to, and she recognized that, because she'd once been something like that too. She didn't push the conversation further than it wanted to go. When he slid off the stool 40 minutes later and left without much of a farewell, she didn't call after him or make it significant. She just let him go. The first week was about earning the right to be there. Vivian understood this as a practical matter, not a philosophical one. She was a stranger in a house that had settled into its grief and its habits, and the worst thing she could do was arrive with the energy of someone who thought things needed to be fixed. They did need to be fixed, in certain ways. The kitchen certainly needed organizing. The pantry needed restocking. The range needed a cleaning that hadn't been done properly in months. But the way to fix things in a household that had been hurting was quietly and without announcement. So she made good food. Reliable food first. The biscuits every morning, a proper hot lunch that the hands could carry to the field in covered pots, a supper that was warm and had enough variety that nobody felt like they were eating the same thing 3 times in a row. She sharpened the knives on the whetstone she found in the barn. She reorganized the pantry on a Tuesday morning when everyone was occupied elsewhere and said nothing about it. She fixed the oven door hinge herself with a screwdriver she borrowed from the tool shed. Calloway came through the kitchen on the Thursday of her first week, ostensibly to discuss the supply order, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the counter. Clean, organized, everything in its place, and the pantry, labeled, orderly, no longer a guessing game. And he didn't say much, but she could tell he noticed. "Everything working?" he asked. "So far." "Hands seem happier." "They were hungry," she said. "That's easy to fix." He almost smiled at that and left. Adrian Hawthorne came through the kitchen most mornings for his coffee, and some evenings he'd return for a second cup after supper, standing at the window in that same quiet way. He didn't make conversation for its own sake, and neither did she. But sometimes a question would occur to him. What she'd use to make the gravy taste different, whether she knew anything about preserving the last of the winter vegetables. And she'd answer directly, and he'd nod, and that was that. He was not an easy man to read. She wasn't trying especially hard to read him. She had her own concerns occupying her attention, and they took up a great deal of space. Because on the morning of her 6th day at Blackstone Ranch, she'd looked out the kitchen window while the coffee was brewing and seen, on the ridge that overlooked the south pasture, a rider standing still against the pale winter sky. Just watching. She turned away from the window before she let herself react. Gone back to the coffee. Checked, as casually as she could manage, twice more over the next hour. The rider was gone. It might have been nothing. A ranch hand from a neighboring property, checking boundaries, a traveler, any number of ordinary explanations. But Vivian had lived long enough with the specific sensation of being watched that she knew the difference between someone passing through and someone looking for something. And the way that rider had been still, not moving, not doing anything, just positioned on that ridge in a way that had a clear line of sight to the main house. That was not the stillness of coincidence. She told herself she might be wrong. She told herself Silver Creek was far enough. She kept making breakfast. She kept her face calm. She kept her hands from shaking by making them busy, which was what she'd learned to do. But that evening, when the house was quiet and Ethan was asleep, and the ranch hands were settled in the bunkhouse, and Adrian Hawthorne had gone to his study, Vivian sat in the kitchen alone and looked at the leather satchel she kept on the shelf in her room, but had brought down tonight, for reasons she wasn't quite ready to name. She opened it, checked that what was inside was still there. It was. She closed it again. Outside, the Montana winter was absolute and silent and cold. The mountains were dark shapes against a sky full of stars. It looked like the edge of the world, or possibly the end of one. She set the satchel down on the kitchen table, poured herself the last of the coffee, sat with both hands around the cup. "Stay," she told herself. "You can stay here." She didn't know yet if it was true. But she needed to believe it was true enough to keep getting up in the morning and making breakfast and sharpening knives and letting a quiet boy sit on a stool and learn the sound of a proper simmer. She needed this to be the place where the running stopped. The kitchen was warm. The fire was going. Outside, the wind moved across the ridge where the rider had been standing, and there was nothing there now but the dark and the snow and the cold Montana stars. Vivian Sterling sat alone at the table, her hands around her cup, and waited to find out which way it would go. The rider came back. Not to the same ridge. She might have convinced herself it was the same person, the same coincidence, if it had been the same ridge. But it wasn't. This time it was the tree line along the east pasture fence, barely visible in the gray morning light, and Vivian only caught it because she'd developed the habit, over years she preferred not to count, of looking before she was looked at. She was carrying a covered pot of oatmeal across the yard to the bunkhouse when she saw him. A figure on a dark horse, half hidden by the bare cottonwoods, not moving, just there. The same quality of stillness as before, purposeful, patient, the kind that doesn't belong to someone who's simply passing through. She kept walking. She didn't change her pace. She delivered the oatmeal, exchanged a few words with Marsh about the supply list, and walked back to the main house with her spine straight and her face arranged in an expression that had nothing particular in it. Inside, she set the pot in the basin and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the tree line. Empty now. Just the cottonwoods and the frost on the fence posts and the pale January sky behind everything. You might be imagining it, she thought. She'd thought that before, in other places. She'd been wrong to dismiss it every single time. She went about the morning, made Adrian's coffee, started the bread dough because she'd been making fresh bread on Tuesdays and Fridays, and it was Friday. Let Ethan, who had taken to appearing in the kitchen sometime between 7 and 8, with the same studied casualness of someone who wasn't going to admit he was looking forward to something, show her where the extra salt was kept on the high shelf she hadn't found yet. Behind the cornmeal, he said. Mrs. Pruitt put everything behind other things. I don't know why. Mrs. Pruitt was the cook before. Before the ranch hands took over. She left in the summer. He paused. She said it was too lonely, but I think she and Uncle Adrian argued about something. Vivian glanced at him. He was matter-of-fact about it, not looking for sympathy or drama, just reporting what he'd observed with the precise neutrality of a child who'd learned to interpret adult behavior by watching it carefully because nobody was explaining it to him. Did they argue often, she asked, not because it was her business, but because he'd opened the door and she thought closing it immediately would be unkind. Uncle Adrian doesn't argue exactly, Ethan said, considering. He goes quiet, and then people leave. She handed him a piece of bread dough to knead, which she'd started doing the previous week after noticing that he did better with conversation when his hands were occupied. He took it without comment and started working it against the floured board. "Were you and Mrs. Pruitt close?" she asked. "Not really." He was quiet for a moment. "She called me the boy." Vivian said nothing to that. She shaped her own portion of the dough. After a while, Ethan said, without looking up, "You call me by my name." "That's your name," she said. He kept kneading and didn't say anything else, but the line of his shoulders, which were usually held tight with that careful self-containment of his, eased slightly. Just slightly. She noticed and filed it away and kept working. Yeah, the trial period ended on a Wednesday. Calloway came to the kitchen that morning, sat at the table with his coffee, and said in his direct way, "Mr. Hawthorne wants to make the arrangement permanent. Same terms. You agreeable?" "I am," she said. "Good." He drank his coffee. "I'll let him know." He was about to leave, then stopped. "Hands are better, morale-wise. I don't know what you're putting in that soup, but whatever it is, keep doing it." "Salt," she said, "and time. That's most of it." He looked at her in a way that suggested he thought there was something more to it than that, but wasn't going to argue the point. "Well, whatever it is." She almost told him then about the rider. She was sitting there with the coffee pot in her hand, and the words were right there. "I've seen someone watching the ranch, 2 mornings, east fence line," and she considered saying it, but she didn't know yet what it meant. She didn't know if it was what she feared or something else entirely. And if she said it, she'd have to explain why a stranger on a distant ridge made her throat go tight, and that explanation had a long and complicated history that she wasn't ready to offer to anyone yet. She put the coffee pot down. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." He nodded and left. 3 days later, the stranger came into town. Vivian was on her Thursday supply run, driving the small ranch wagon into Silver Creek with her list of provisions. She'd pulled up in front of Henderson's general store and was unloading the empty crates when she heard the coach arrive. Not the regular stagecoach from Billings, which she knew by its schedule, but a private rig, well appointed, the horses better bred than anything you typically saw on that road in winter. The man who stepped out of it was dressed in a manner that was slightly too fine for Silver Creek. Not ostentatious, not the kind of flashy that drew attention on purpose, but simply well made in a way that announced money without intending to announce anything. He was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with iron gray hair, and the kind of self-possessed manner that came not from warmth, but from never having had much cause to doubt that things would arrange themselves according to his preference. He spoke briefly to someone, his driver, she thought, and then turned to survey the main street of Silver Creek in the way of a man assessing property he's considering purchasing. Vivian had turned away before his gaze reached her side of the street. She was lifting a crate. She was doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. But her heart was going fast in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. She didn't know his face. She was almost certain she'd never seen him in person. But she recognized the type, the particular quality of authority he carried, the way he looked at a town, the way you'd look at a problem to be solved rather than a place where people lived. And she recognized the private rig, because she'd seen a rig exactly like it, with that particular wheel design, parked outside a building in Denver 18 months ago. She finished loading the provisions. She drove back to the ranch. She did not look back. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in her room off the kitchen with her eyes open and the leather satchel on the floor beside the bed, and she ran through the calculations she'd been running for 2 years, the same calculation with new variables. What she knew? A financial syndicate. She'd learned to call it that, the neutrally legal-sounding word for what was actually a coordinated predatory operation, had been systematically acquiring cattle ranches across the frontier through a combination of fraudulent debt instruments, manipulated legal proceedings, and in at least 3 cases she could document, outright bribery of territorial officials. The ranchers who'd lost their properties hadn't lost them through bad luck or poor management. They'd been targeted, maneuvered, and stripped. She'd stumbled onto the evidence not through any great act of investigation, but through the particular accident of being good at her job. She'd worked in a household in Denver, a wealthy attorney's household, and the attorney had been involved. He hadn't worried about the cook overhearing things in the way he worried about other people, because people with certain kinds of money almost never thought about the people making their food. That was his mistake. Hers was staying long enough to understand what she was hearing. By the time she understood it fully enough to recognize its scale, she'd also understood that simply leaving was no longer sufficient protection. She'd already heard too much. And someone in that household had noticed her noticing. She'd left Denver with what she had. She'd been moving since. The documents in the satchel, copied carefully in her own hand from records she'd had access to in that household, supplemented with things she'd gathered in the months since, were the only reason she was valuable to them alive and dangerous to them free. If she could get those documents to the right person, a federal prosecutor with enough authority and enough integrity that he couldn't be bought, the entire operation could be exposed. She'd been trying to find that person for 2 years. The problem was that the syndicate's reach was longer than she'd initially understood, and she'd learned to be very careful before trusting anyone with what she carried. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle and thought, they found Silver Creek. Maybe they found me specifically. Maybe not yet. Maybe they're working outward from where they lost my trail. Maybe. The word that kept you sane and also kept you moving in circles. She was still awake when the sky began to lighten, and she got up and made the coffee and started the morning. She watched for the stranger in Silver Creek over the next 2 Thursdays. He was still there. She saw him the first Thursday outside the land office, speaking with the clerk Parsons, whose hair was parted too severely. She didn't stop. She did her shopping at a slightly different pace than usual, and she kept her back to him when she could, and she drove home. The second Thursday, he was in Henderson's when she went in. This time there was no avoiding proximity. The store was small, the provisioning list was what it was, and she had to be there. She moved through her list with focused efficiency, keeping her face turned toward the shelves, and she was nearly at the counter when he spoke. "Excuse me, miss." She turned, Close up, he was more ordinary looking than at a distance, which was somehow worse. He had a pleasant face, the kind of pleasant that was a professional acquisition rather than a natural characteristic. I wonder if you could help me. I'm looking into some properties in the area, land acquisition, preliminary survey work. Do you happen to know who the major landowners are in the county? It was a reasonable question, the kind of question anyone might ask a stranger in a general store. She met his eyes, held them for exactly the right amount of time, not too long, not the quick dart away of someone hiding, and said, I'm afraid I couldn't say. I haven't been in the area very long myself. Is that right? Where did you come through from? North, she said. Excuse me. She paid for her provisions and left. On the drive back to the ranch, she kept both hands on the reins and let the cold air work on her face, and tried to assess what had just happened with as little panic as possible. He hadn't recognized her. She was almost certain of that. The question had been general, conversational, the opening move of someone gathering information about a place rather than someone who'd found a specific person. There'd been no flash of recognition in his eyes when she turned, no microsecond of the calculation that happened when someone found what they were looking for. But he was here, in Silver Creek, asking about land and property owners. And Blackstone Ranch was the most significant land holding in the county. She was almost back to the ranch when she made the decision, or the decision made her. Sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. She needed to tell Adrian Hawthorne. Not everything. Not yet. But enough that he wasn't blindsided if something came to his door. She waited for the right moment, which took 2 more days to arrive. It came on a Sunday evening. The ranch hands had a half-day Sundays, which meant supper was served early, and by 7 o'clock the bunkhouse was settled and Ethan was upstairs with the history book he'd been working through. She'd learned that he read history rather than fiction, which she found interesting and hadn't commented on. And Adrian Hawthorne was in the kitchen doorway with his evening coffee, which had become a quiet habit between them. I need to tell you something, she said. He looked at her. He'd been looking out the window, but he stopped doing that. All right. She set down the cloth she'd been using to wipe the counter and turned to face him properly, because this wasn't the kind of conversation you had sideways. There's a man in Silver Creek. He arrived about 2 weeks ago, private rig, well-dressed. He's been asking around about property and landowners in the area. Adrian's expression didn't change much, but something in it sharpened. What kind of asking? The kind that sounds like casual conversation, but is actually information gathering. He spoke to me on Thursday in the store, asked where I'd come through from, who the major landowners were. What did you tell him? Nothing useful. She paused. Mr. Hawthorne, I think he may be looking at Blackstone Ranch specifically, whether as a business opportunity or... She stopped, chose the next words with care. I don't know the nature of his interest, but I thought you should be aware of him. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that dark, assessing look of his. She'd learned by now that the quietness wasn't hostility. It was how he processed things, how he separated what he actually knew from what he was being told. And you're telling me this because... He left the end open. Because you've given me work, and a room, and a fair wage, she said. And because whatever his interest is, it doesn't feel right. Has he been out to the property? Not that I've seen, but I saw a rider watching the ranch, twice, from different positions. That was before this man arrived in town. His jaw tightened. A small movement. When were the riders? Second week I was here, and the week after. He was quiet again, longer this time. Why didn't you tell me sooner? It was a fair question, and he deserved a direct answer. Because I wasn't certain. I'm still not certain. But uncertain felt less important than saying nothing. He looked at her for a long moment, and she held his gaze and didn't add anything, because she'd learned that adding things when they weren't needed was a way of undermining the things you'd already said. Thank you for telling me, he said finally. I'll have Calloway look into who this man is. He's staying at the Silver Creek Hotel, registered as... She'd taken the trouble of finding this out through a conversation with Widow Farrar, who knew everything that happened in that town. A Mr. Denton, from Chicago. Something moved across Adrian's face at that, brief and quickly controlled, but she caught it. She filed it away and didn't ask. All right, he said. She nodded, picked up the cloth, and went back to the counter. She heard him leave the kitchen, and then she heard his study door close, harder than usual. She'd expected the information to buy her a few days of quiet. What she hadn't expected was for Calloway to come to the kitchen the following Tuesday morning with a look on his face that told her the situation had evolved faster than either of them anticipated. "There's something I need to ask you," he said. He didn't sit down, which was unusual. Calloway generally moved through the world as though there was no emergency so significant that it required a change of posture. "Ask it," she said. "This man Denton," Bert looked into him. He'd taken to occasionally referring to himself in the third person when he was organizing his thoughts, which she'd noticed. "He's not a land surveyor. He works for a financial firm out of Chicago, but the firm's been linked to There's been some talk in the territorial papers about land acquisitions that weren't above board." She was very still. "Mr. Hawthorne says you knew something felt wrong about him before any of this came out," Calloway continued, watching her. "You want to tell me why that is?" This was the moment. She'd known it was coming. She'd been preparing for it and not preparing for it simultaneously, the way you braced for something when you already knew you weren't going to enjoy it. "Close the door," she said. He did. She took her apron off and set it on the counter, which wasn't something she'd planned to do, but apparently her hands needed something to do while she organized 18 months of careful silence into words she'd never said out loud to anyone. "There's a syndicate," she said. "I don't know its proper name or even if it has one. What I know is that it's a coordinated operation. They identify large, profitable ranching operations, the kind with real land value and cash flow, not just acreage, and they find a way in. Sometimes it's fraudulent debt. Someone buys up the notes on the property and then calls them in at terms the owner can't meet. Sometimes it's legal maneuvering, manufactured disputes over boundary lines or water rights. They have access to people in territorial government, clerks, judges in some cases. I've seen documentation." Calloway had gone very still. "What kind of documentation?" "Records, correspondence, transaction records showing money moving between the firm and territorial officials. Names, dates, amounts." She looked at him steadily. "I worked in a household in Denver. The man of the house was an attorney who did legal work for this syndicate. He wasn't careful about what was said in front of the household staff." The silence stretched out. She could hear the fire in the stove, the distant sound of someone in the yard. "And these documents," Calloway said slowly, "you have them. Copies, made in my own hand. Yes. That's why you've been moving. Yes." He sat down then. "Lord Almighty," he said quietly, "I've been trying to find a federal prosecutor I can trust with them, someone outside the reach of whoever these people know. I haven't found the right person yet. I haven't been in any one place long enough to know who to trust. And now Denton's here. I don't know if he's here specifically for me or if he's here because Blackstone Ranch is a target regardless. It might be both. It might be neither." She picked up the apron again, then put it back down. "I should have told you all of this before accepting the position. I understand if you want me to go." Calloway looked at her for a long time. He had the face of a man doing complicated arithmetic. "Does Mr. Hawthorne know this?" "Not all of it, not yet." "He needs to." "I know." He stood up, adjusted his hat, which he was still wearing because he'd come in a hurry. "I'll set up a time this evening. After supper. You'll tell him what you told me. All right?" He was at the door when he stopped. "Vivian." It was the first time he'd used her given name. "Those documents you mentioned, you kept them all this time, all that moving around. That took nerve." She looked at the stove. "It took stubbornness," she said. "I'm not sure it's the same thing." He left. She stood in the kitchen alone and put her apron back on and started on the bread, because the bread still needed to be made, and it seemed important, in the specific way that ordinary things become important when everything else is tipping toward chaos, to make it. She told Adrian that evening, the same version she'd given Calloway, but fuller. She'd had the afternoon to decide how much to say, and she'd decided to say all of it. She sat across from him at the study desk, and she talked for almost an hour, and he listened in that way of his, without interrupting, without the face of someone who was formulating his response while she was still speaking. He just listened. When she finished, the fire had burned lower in the grate. He hadn't moved much. "The documents," he said, "they're at the ranch. In my room, yes. And you believe this man Denton is connected to the same syndicate?" "I believe so. The firm he works for was mentioned in correspondence I copied. I'd need to see the exact name again to be certain, but the geography and the timing are... She stopped. Yes, I believe so. He was quiet. Why did you come here specifically? To Silver Creek? She told him about Margaret Finch. She told him the honest version, that she'd needed to stop moving, that she'd let herself believe this was far enough, that she'd been wrong in that particular hope before and hadn't entirely stopped hoping it anyway. He listened to this too. When she was done, he got up and put another piece of wood on the fire and stood with his back to her for a moment, looking at the grate. You should have told me at the beginning, he said. I know. That's not... He turned. I'm not angry. I understand why you didn't. I'm saying it for what it's worth. She nodded. You're not leaving, he said. It wasn't a question exactly, but it wasn't quite a statement either. If you want me to go, I'll go. I won't argue with you about it. You didn't agree to this, and you owe me nothing. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she held still under it and waited, because she'd learned that he came to conclusions at his own pace, and there was no rushing him. You've been running for 2 years, he said, about that. And these documents could end it if the right person received them. That's what I believe, yes. He walked to the window. The ranch yard was dark, the bunkhouse showing a warm line of light under its door, the mountains invisible now but present somehow, the way large things are present even in darkness. He looked out at it for a moment. I know a federal prosecutor, he said, Marcus Webb, out of the district court in Helena. He came through about 8 months ago on an unrelated matter, water rights dispute with a neighboring territory. He chose the word carefully, honest. The kind of honest that's inconvenient, that doesn't make his life easier, that kind. Vivian sat very still. You trust him? I trusted his inconvenient honesty, which is not quite the same thing. But yes, more than I trust most people who hold that kind of position. She looked at her hands on her knees. I've been looking for someone like that for 2 years, she said, and was careful to say it without too much of what she felt about it, because what she felt was a complicated and somewhat overwhelming thing. I know, he said. I'm not saying we send him a letter tonight. I'm saying there might be a next step. She nodded. He turned her from the window. He looked tired in a way that was real and not performed, and she thought, briefly, not intrusively, just as an observation, that grief made certain people deeper and certain people hollower, and Adrian Hawthorne had gone deeper. She didn't say it. Get some sleep, he said. We'll think through it in the morning. She said good night. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the counter for a while without doing anything, just standing, letting the evening settle into some kind of shape she could hold. From upstairs she heard the creak of a floorboard. Ethan, who went to bed at 9 but rarely seemed to sleep immediately, wandering his room in the dark the way unhappy children sometimes did. She listened until the creaking stopped. Then she banked the kitchen fire, checked the doors, and went to her room. She lay down with the satchel beside the bed. Outside, the wind had come up and was moving across the property in long, low sweeps, the sound of it coming through the walls like the whole Montana winter pressing in. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep for a long time, but she stayed. That, she supposed, was something. The next morning came in cold and clear, the kind of Montana winter day where the sky was a hard, pale blue, and the light had no warmth in it despite being bright. Vivian was up before 5. She didn't remember deciding to get up. She just found herself in the kitchen with the fire going and the coffee on, standing at the window looking out at the dark yard. The same way she'd been standing at windows in various kitchens for 2 years now, checking. Nothing on the ridge, nothing at the fence line, just the frost on the ground catching the first gray light, and the shapes of the barns and the mountains beyond everything, standing the way they always stood, indifferent and permanent, and somehow reassuring in their indifference. She heard Adrian's steps on the stairs at 6. He came into the kitchen looking like a man who hadn't slept especially well, which she recognized because she suspected she looked the same way. He poured his coffee without speaking, stood at the window beside her, looking out at the same view. After a while, he said, I'm going to reach out to Marcus Webb. She looked at the yard. Through the mail? Telegraph. There's a private line through the land office. The Hawthornes were among the early investors in the county line when it went in. It goes through Parsons, but Parsons answers to me in certain matters. He paused. I'll word it so it doesn't say anything directly, but Webb knows how to read between lines. How long would it take him to respond? Days? Maybe a week? He's based in Helena, but he travels the circuit. Another pause. It's not fast. It's faster than anything else I've had, she said. He looked at her then, sideways. She was still looking out the window. The sky was beginning to lighten properly now, the dark softening into gray at the eastern edge. What you did, he said, carrying that for 2 years, working in other people's houses and keeping it quiet. She didn't say anything. That's not nothing, he said. She turned from the window and went back to the stove, because she had bread to check and eggs to start and 12 hungry ranch hands who would arrive for breakfast in 40 minutes regardless of what else was happening. Send the telegraph, she said. That's what matters right now. He nodded and left. She thought they had more time. That was the thing she'd revisit later, the assumption that had felt reasonable given what she knew, and turned out to be the specific kind of wrong that cost you the most. She'd thought Denton's presence in Silver Creek was still the early phase, information gathering, preliminary assessment, the careful work of a man who hadn't yet identified his primary target with certainty. She was wrong about the certainty part. 3 days after Adrian sent the telegraph, a carriage arrived at the front gate of Blackstone Ranch. It was midday. Vivian was in the kitchen making a proper lunch, and she heard it before she saw it. The creak and rumble of a well-sprung private carriage coming up the main road. The sound different from the ranch supply wagons she'd memorized in her first weeks. She went to the window. The carriage was black. It had that same wheel design. She set her stirring spoon down on the counter, wiped her hands on her apron, walked to the doorway of the kitchen and into the hallway, where she could see through the front window without being seen through it. 3 men got out of the carriage. 2 she didn't know, large, plainly dressed, the kind of men who are hired for their physical presence rather than their conversational skills. The third was not Denton. He was older than Denton, silver-haired, well-dressed, in the way of someone for whom dressing well was a habit so old it required no thought. He moved with a deliberateness that was the physical expression of someone accustomed to having time operate on his schedule rather than the other way around. He looked at the main house and at the yard and at the barns beyond, with the same quality of assessment she'd seen in Denton and Silver Creek. Property surveying eyes, everything reduced to its functional and monetary value. She'd seen this man's name in the documents she'd copied. She was almost certain of it. Vincent Caldwell. She was still standing in the hallway when Adrian came down the front stairs, having apparently seen the carriage from his study window. He passed her in the hallway and she said quietly, "The man in front, I think his name is Caldwell. I've seen the name in the documents." Adrian stopped, looked at her. His face did the thing it did when he was processing something significant. Very still, the eyes doing all the work. "You're certain?" "Not entirely. 80%. He held her gaze for another second. Then he straightened his jacket, which was a small, unconscious gesture of self-preparation, and opened the front door. She went back to the kitchen doorway and listened. The conversation on the front porch was not long, and it was not subtle. She could hear most of it through the window she'd cracked, the cold air coming in, but worth it. Adrian's voice first, even and unrevealing, asking the nature of the visit. Then the older man's voice, smooth, measured, the kind of voice that had been trained over decades to sound reasonable, regardless of what it was saying. He introduced himself as Vincent Caldwell, representing a financial investment group based in Chicago. He was very sorry to arrive without advance notice. He'd tried to arrange a meeting through proper channels, but had understood that Mr. Hawthorne was a difficult man to reach. He was interested in discussing a potential acquisition. Blackstone Ranch was, by any measure, one of the most valuable private land holdings in the Montana Territory, and his firm was prepared to make an offer of extraordinary generosity. Perhaps Mr. Hawthorne would like to hear the number before making any decisions. A brief silence. Then Adrian, "I'm not interested in selling." Caldwell, with the patience of a man who'd been told no before and found it only a temporary condition. "I understand that, Mr. Hawthorne, and I respect it. But I wonder if you'd allow me to come in out of the cold, at least for a few minutes. There are some aspects of the offer that I believe would look very different once you understood the full picture." Another silence. Longer this time. "You can come in," Adrian said. For a few minutes. She heard the door open and the sound of boots on the front floor. She stayed in the kitchen. She took the spoon off the counter and went back to the pot on the stove and kept stirring, and she kept her breathing steady and her movements ordinary, because Ethan was somewhere in the house and the ranch hands were in the yard, and whatever was happening in the front sitting room was happening to Adrian right now, not to her, and her job in this moment was to not make things worse by making them bigger. 15 minutes passed. She stirred. She sliced bread. She checked the fire. Then she heard the front door again, and voices that were no longer the careful voices of a managed conversation. She put the spoon down. Adrian's voice was controlled, but the control had an edge in it. I've heard your offer, Mr. Caldwell, and my answer is no. It was no before you told me the number, and it's no after. I'd ask you to leave now. Caldwell. Mr. Hawthorne, I think you may not be fully appreciating what I'm telling you. This isn't merely a business matter. There are circumstances surrounding certain properties in this county that could complicate your legal standing considerably. A thorough review of land records, water rights documentation, outstanding financial instruments. Are you threatening me? Adrian said. Still controlled, but the edge was sharper. I'm describing a landscape, Caldwell said, the smooth voice going just slightly cool. One that could become difficult to navigate without the right relationships. I'm offering you those relationships. A silence that felt like a held breath. Get off my property, Adrian said. She heard the door. She heard the carriage. She heard it move down the road. Then she heard Adrian's footsteps in the hall, and he came into the kitchen, and he stood there for a moment looking at the pot on the stove and not saying anything. She waited. He offered me $250,000, he said. She kept her face neutral. That was an enormous sum. Large enough to be insulting in a specific way, the kind of number designed to make refusal feel irrational. He also told me there might be complications with my legal standing if I was uncooperative, he continued. He didn't specify. He didn't need to. No, she said. He wouldn't. He came fully into the kitchen and sat down at the table, the first time she'd seen him sit in the kitchen rather than stand at the doorway. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. He knows you're here. She'd been expecting this. Did he say so? Not directly. But he knew I'd recently hired household staff. He mentioned it as part of the landscape, an observation. He looked up. He knows, or suspects strongly enough that it amounts to the same thing. She untied her apron and sat down across from him. This was not the time for the apron or the stirring spoon. Then we don't have as long as we thought. No. Has Mr. Webb responded to the telegraph? Not yet. She folded her hands on the table. Outside, the bright cold day was going on exactly as it had been. The hands working in the yard, the horses moving in the near pasture, the ordinary noise of a working ranch doing what it did. The normalcy of it felt strange now, slightly false, the way a painted backdrop looks fine until someone walks close enough to see the brushstrokes. I need to say something to you, she said. He waited. If you cooperate with him, if you sell, or if you give him what he wants in whatever form he's decided he wants it, this ends for you cleanly. He gets what he came for. I leave, or he removes me, and Blackstone Ranch goes on, probably under his firm's management, but it goes on. She kept her eyes on his. I am not so important that you should lose what your family built for 3 generations on my account. He was quiet for a moment. Is that what you think I should do? I think you should know that it's an option. He looked at the table. Then he looked at her. What do those documents you've been carrying mean if you get them to someone who can use them? Dozens of families who lost their ranches might get them back. The people who took them would go to prison. The bribery that made it possible would be exposed. And Caldwell? He's the center of it from what I've seen. He goes down with the rest. Adrian sat with this. She watched him sit with it, the way his jaw worked slightly, the way he looked at the table as though the surface of it held something useful. She'd come to understand, in the weeks she'd spent in this house, that this was how he actually made decisions, not quickly, not impulsively, but through some internal process that moved at its own speed and produced, when it arrived, conclusions he didn't second-guess. My wife, he said, and then stopped. She waited. Her family lost their land, before I knew her. Her father's ranch in Wyoming. There was a dispute over water rights that went on for years and bankrupted them eventually. She grew up after that, in a family that had been taken apart by something they never fully understood. He was still looking at the table. She never talked about it much, but she felt it. Vivian said nothing. Vivian, if someone had done what you're trying to do, he said, someone who had the evidence and got it to the right person, her family might have kept what they built. The kitchen was very quiet. Where do we need to go? He said. She looked at him. Helena. If Webb is on circuit, he might be closer, but his offices are in Helena. That's 3 days' ride in winter. Faster by horse than wagon if we're willing to be cold. I'm willing to be cold. The smallest thing moved across his face. Not quite a smile, something older than a smile. So am I. He stood up. I'll talk to Calloway tonight. He'll hold things here while we're gone. He paused. Ethan stays. I'll tell him... He stopped, working out what to tell an 11-year-old boy. I'll tell him it's a business trip. He's smart enough to know it isn't, she said. I know, but I need him to stay. And if he understands what it is, he'll want to come. A brief, strained look crossed his face. He's lost too many people already. I'm not taking him into this. She nodded. He left to find Calloway. She sat at the kitchen table for a moment alone, then got up and went back to the stove because the soup had gone too long without attention, and she was not going to let a pot burn because she was frightened. She went to bed that night not expecting to sleep, and she was right about that. She lay in the dark, running through what she'd need to take, how the documents were packed, what the 3-day route to Helena looked like in February conditions. She'd studied maps. That was another habit of the past 2 years. She always knew where things were relative to where she stood. It was somewhere around midnight that she heard it. At first it didn't register as wrong. The wind had come up hours ago, and it had been moving around the buildings with that particular February insistence, making its sounds against the walls and the roof. She'd been listening to it without really hearing it. But this was different. She was sitting up in bed before she'd consciously decided to. The smell reached her at the same moment. Faint, but specific. Smoke. Not kitchen smoke, not the good smell of a banked fire. The other kind. The wrong kind. She was at the door and in the hallway in seconds. The house itself was clear. No smoke inside, no heat from the wrong direction. She went to the kitchen window. The north barn was on fire. It had caught well along the east wall. The orange light was already significant, the kind of light that meant it had been going for several minutes before she'd woken. She could see it pulsing against the dark sky. And as she stood there, it grew visibly, the way a well-caught fire grows, with confidence. She pulled her boots on, grabbed her coat, hit the back door at a run, and started shouting before she was fully across the yard. Fire! The north barn! Fire! The bunkhouse erupted almost immediately. Voices, boots, doors, the practiced chaos of ranch hands who'd all had the fire fear drilled into them from their first day on any property. Marsh came out pulling his suspenders up with one hand and already moving toward the pump with the other. Calloway appeared from somewhere, fully dressed, which she thought even in that moment was interesting. Get the bucket line going, he was already shouting. Cody, get the horses out of the south pen, move them away from the heat. The north barn held hay and equipment, no animals in this cold month. That was something, that was a mercy. But the barn itself was one of the largest structures on the property, and if it went fully, it would take the equipment and the hay reserve and a significant piece of the ranch's infrastructure with it. Vivian ran to the pump and started working it. The water came up cold and sluggish in the February night, and she worked it harder. Adrian appeared at her side 30 seconds later, coat over his nightshirt, and he looked at the barn and the bucket line forming, and then he looked at her with an expression that had moved past surprise into something colder and more focused. Calloway, he said. His voice carried in the freezing night air. The pump on the east side. Already on it, Calloway called back. They fought it for 2 hours. She was in the bucket line for most of that time, which meant she passed and received and passed and received, while her arms went from aching to burning to a dull, mechanical numbness that she stopped registering. At some point during the second hour, she was aware that her hands were bleeding where the bucket handle had worked through the skin, though she couldn't feel the pain specifically. It was just another piece of information in a night that had too many pieces of information. They saved the barn. Barely. The east wall was gone, and the roof had partially collapsed at that end, but the structure stood and the fire was out before it jumped to the hay in the western section or to the equipment shed adjacent. The hay reserve would last the winter. The equipment was intact. When it was clearly over, when the last ember had been tracked down and the bucket line had broken up into a small cluster of exhausted, smoke-smelling men, Calloway walked the perimeter of the barn alone and came back to where Adrian was standing. Origin point was the east wall, he said. Bottom corner. Where it starts matters. Accident starts from a lantern dropped inside, from a spark off a hoof in a stall. Starting from the outside bottom corner of an empty barn at midnight in February is not an accident. The men who heard this went quiet. Adrian looked at the ruined wall. The smoke was still rising from it in thin, pale columns. He looked at it for a long time. "Nobody was hurt?" he asked. "All hands accounted for," Calloway said. "Young Cody got his eyebrows singed, but nothing worse." "Good." He was quiet for another moment. "Calloway, make sure the south barn has a watch on it for the rest of the night. Rotate the hands." "Already planning on it." Adrian turned and walked back toward the house. He stopped when he came level with Vivian, who was standing with the bucket still loosely in her hand, and he looked at her hands and at her face. "You're bleeding," he said. She looked at her hands as though seeing them for the first time. The right one was worse, a stripe across the palm where the handle had worn through. "It's not bad. Come inside. There's a medicine kit in the kitchen." She followed him in. He found the kit, and she let him clean her hands over the basin, which was a strange and unceremonious intimacy. Standing at the kitchen sink in the small hours smelling of smoke, his hands careful with the cloth in a way that was competent rather than tender, but landed somehow as both. "He's telling us to move," she said. "This is what that looks like. Not the offer and not the threat. This. I know. He expected you to come to him tonight, to renegotiate." "He'll be waiting a long time," Adrian said. He tied the cloth around her palm. It was slightly too tight. Then he loosened it a fraction. "We leave in the morning." She looked at her wrapped hand. "Adrian." It was the first time she'd used his name. She didn't apologize for it. "This is going to get more dangerous before it resolves. Not dangerous the way frontier weather is dangerous. Deliberately dangerous because there's a great deal of money involved and men who've killed for that kind of money before." "I know," he said. "You should know that I—" She stopped, looked at the wrapped hand, started again. "I don't make a habit of involving other people in my problems. I've gone out of my way not to. If there had been another path from Silver Creek that didn't bring this here, I would have taken it." He was looking at her. The kitchen was lit by a single lamp, and they were both smoke-stained and tired, and her hand was wrapped in a strip of cotton, and none of it seemed like a moment for anything important to be said. And yet, here they were. "But you're here," he said. "I'm here. And so is this." He meant the barn, the fire, the night, the whole weight of it. "Yes." He put the medicine kit away. He leaned back against the counter and crossed his arms and looked at the floor for a moment. "My wife used to say that things worth doing were worth doing badly first and better later," he said. She had low tolerance for people who waited until conditions were perfect before acting. She thought it was a way of not acting at all. Vivian said nothing, listening. "We don't have perfect conditions," he said. "Webb may not be in Helena when we get there. The route in February is genuinely bad. Caldwell will know we've left the ranch, and he'll know what it probably means." He looked up. "None of that changes the fact that sitting here and waiting him out is not a real option anymore." "No," she said. "It isn't. So we go." "We go." He straightened up. "Get some sleep if you can. We're leaving at first light." He went upstairs. She heard his door. She heard the house settle. She heard, very faintly, the sound of Ethan moving in his room above her. The boy was awake. Had probably been awake for most of the last 2 hours. She thought about going up, decided against it. Some things needed to be said by the right person, and she was not the right person for that conversation. She banked the kitchen fire. She went to her room and lay down with her wrapped hand across her chest and the satchel within reach. The smell of smoke was still in her hair and her coat, and probably would be for days. She thought about what Adrian had said about his wife, the low tolerance for waiting until conditions were perfect. She'd been waiting for 2 years. Not for perfect conditions exactly. She'd never been naive enough to expect those. But for the right person, for the right moment, for something that felt solid enough to risk everything on. She looked at the ceiling in the dark. The Montana cold pressed against the walls. In a few hours, they would ride out through it, carrying what they'd been carrying, towards something that might work or might not. She closed her eyes. She didn't think about what happened if it didn't work. She'd spent 2 years thinking about what happened if it didn't work, and it hadn't helped her once. She thought instead about the fire dying to coals in the kitchen grate, and the bread she'd left half prepared on the counter, and the boy moving quietly upstairs in the dark, and how in the morning she would put on her coat and pick up the satchel and ride out into the frozen Montana morning beside a man who had refused $250,000 and had his barn burned for it. She thought, that's what a person who means it looks like. And then finally, somewhere in the last cold hour before dawn, she slept. They rode out at first light. Vivian had the satchel strapped across her body under her coat, which was the most secure way to carry it, and also the most uncomfortable, the leather edge pressing against her ribs with every movement of the horse. She'd decided during the last hour before dawn that discomfort was preferable to losing it, and that was that. She'd been uncomfortable before. Adrian had selected 2 horses from the South stable, a gray mare for her, steady-tempered and trail-experienced, and his own black gelding that Calloway had quietly told her was the most reliable horse on the property in bad conditions. He'd packed light, a bedroll, provisions for 3 days, a rifle in the saddle scabbard. He'd done it with the efficiency of someone who'd made hard rides before and knew what actually mattered and what was weight you'd regret by the second day. Calloway met them in the yard. It was still dark, just barely not, the sky the color of old pewter at the eastern edge. He stood with his hat in his hands, which was unusual for him. Calloway was a hat-on kind of man, as a general rule. "I'll send word to the Dalton Spread and the Kincaid brothers," he said. "They can have men watching the road in and out." "Don't involve them more than you have to," Adrian said. "This isn't their fight." "They'll want to know," Calloway said. "Kincaid lost a cousin to something like this in Wyoming 2 years back. His words, not mine. He's been watching Denton in town same as we have." He paused. "People talk, Mr. Hawthorne. This has been building for a while. You're not the only one who noticed." Adrian looked at him for a moment, then he gave a short nod. "Use your judgment." "I will." Calloway looked at Vivian. In the dark, his face was hard to read, but she'd gotten reasonably good at reading him anyway. "You get those papers where they need to go," he said. "I will," she said. He stepped back. They rode out through the front gate and onto the road north. The first day was hard in the physical way, cold that worked through every layer you had, the road frozen into ruts that the horses navigated carefully, the wind coming down off the mountains with a directness that felt personal. They didn't talk much. Vivian hadn't expected to, and she didn't find the silence uncomfortable. She'd ridden a great many miles in silence over the past 2 years and had made a kind of peace with it. They stopped mid-morning to water the horses at a creek that was running clear under a thin skin of ice at the edges. Adrian had bread and dried meat in his pack, and they ate without ceremony, standing beside the horses. "How far did you get into Webb's background?" she asked. She'd been thinking about this since they left. "Not as far as I'd like," he said. "He was appointed to the district court position about 4 years ago. Before that, he was in private practice in St. Louis, then worked for the federal attorney's office in Kansas City. He took the Montana appointment when it was offered, which a lot of men with ambition wouldn't have done. Montana doesn't advance careers. It attracts men who are either avoiding something or genuinely interested in the work." "Which do you think he is?" "I asked him when he was at the ranch. He said Montana was the only place left where the law was still being invented, and he'd rather be part of inventing it than enforcing something someone else had already calcified." He paused. It could be a line, but he said it like it wasn't. She thought about this. "Did he know your wife's family, the Wyoming connection?" "No. But when I mentioned it once, the water rights history, he knew the type of case immediately. Named 2 others like it from the same period in Wyoming without any prompting. He was angry about them. Not performed anger, the kind you feel because it violates something you actually believe in." He looked at the horizon. "That's the best indicator I have." "It'll have to do," she said. They mounted and kept riding. Check. They camped that night in the lee of a granite outcrop that blocked the worst of the wind. Adrian built a fire with the practiced economy of a man who knew how much wood he had and exactly how long he needed the fire to last. Vivian made coffee and heated the canned beans she'd packed, which were not good but were hot, and hot mattered more than good in February at altitude. They sat on opposite sides of the fire. The horses were picketed close, their breath fogging in the firelight. "Tell me something about before Denver," he said. She looked at the fire. People didn't usually ask her things like that, and she'd gotten out of the habit of answering them. "What do you want to know?" "Whatever you'd say." She thought about it. "I grew up in Ohio. My father was a school teacher, a good one. My mother died when I was 9. She said this without dramatizing it, the way you report old weather. He raised me and my brother alone. He was better at teaching than raising children, but he did it anyway, and mostly we came out all right." She paused. "He taught me to read properly, which meant he taught me to pay attention to what things actually said rather than what people told me they said. I think that's why I noticed what was in those documents when another person in my position might not have." "What happened to your brother?" "He's in Ohio still. We don't correspond much. He has a family and a life, and She stopped. "For a long time I couldn't write to him without worrying that a letter could be traced. I've gotten out of the habit of being in touch." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "And cooking? Where did that start?" She almost smiled. "Necessity. When my father was teaching late, I made dinner. I was bad at it for about 2 years, and then I started paying attention to what I was doing, and I got better. By the time I was 15, I was good enough that the minister's wife asked me to cook for a church dinner." She paused. "After that, people asked me to cook and paid me for it, and it turned out I could earn a living at it, so I did." "Do you actually like it?" he asked. "Or is it just the thing you're good at?" The question surprised her. Not many people drew that distinction. "Both," she said after thinking about it honestly. "I like the logic of it, that if you pay attention and do the steps in the right order, you get a predictable result. And I like feeding people. Not in an... I don't know how to say this without it sounding sentimental. Say it anyway. There's something that happens when someone eats food that was made with care. They feel it even if they can't name it. They just feel less alone for a few minutes." She looked at the fire. "That's the sentimental version." "It's not wrong, though," he said. She looked across the fire at him. He was looking at the flames, his profile sharp in the orange light. She thought, not for the first time, about the specific kind of solitude he'd been living in. The ranch that ran like a good machine, the boy upstairs, the empty room at the end of the hall that she'd understood without being told was the room he didn't enter. He'd been feeding himself for 3 years on grief and routine and the quiet discipline of managing a large operation. And she wondered what it had cost him. She didn't ask. It was his to carry. "We should sleep," she said. "Long day tomorrow." "Yes." He fed the last piece of wood to the fire. "Vivian." He said her name the way she'd said his, direct, without the formality they'd both been using, as if they'd silently agreed that out here, 2 days from the ranch, with everything at stake, the formality was a luxury they could put down. "The documents you've been carrying," he said. "Even if Webb can act on them, the trial, the legal process, that takes time. Months, possibly years. Caldwell will know what we've done the moment we get back." "Yes." "Can you live with that? With staying in one place while the legal machinery does what it does, which is move slowly and without any guarantees?" She looked at the dying fire. "I've been moving for 2 years," she said. "I'm very tired of moving." He was quiet for a moment, then, "All right." They slept. But they reached Helena on the afternoon of the 3rd day, coming in from the south road with the mountains at their backs, and the last light of the day turning the territorial capital's rooftops a dull gold. Vivian's legs ached from the saddle, and her wrapped hand had stiffened in the cold to the point where she'd had to think consciously about grip for the last several miles. She didn't say any of this. The federal court offices were on the main street, a solid brick building that looked like someone had built it to last on purpose. There was a light in the upper window. Adrian dismounted and looked up at the light. "He's here," he said. "Or someone is." They tied the horses and went in. The clerk at the front desk was a young man in his 20s with ink on his fingers, who looked up at them with the mild alarm of someone who'd been expecting no visitors at this hour on a winter afternoon. Adrian asked for Marcus Webb. The clerk said Mr. Webb was working late but had asked not to be disturbed. "Tell him Adrian Hawthorne is here," Adrian said from Silver Creek. "He'll see us." The clerk went upstairs. Vivian stood in the entrance hall with the satchel against her ribs, and 3 days of travel on her and the smell of horses and wood smoke that she'd stopped being able to smell on herself but was perfectly aware was there. The building was warm. She hadn't been warm in 3 days, and the warmth now felt slightly unreal, the way comfort did when you'd been without it long enough. The clerk came back down. "He'll see you, both of you." But Marcus Webb was not what she'd constructed in her mind during 3 days of riding. She'd built him, without intending to, into someone imposing, large perhaps, or silver-tongued, with the bearing of someone who wielded significant institutional authority. What she found was a man in his mid-40s of medium height, with the build of someone who'd been athletic 20 years ago and still moved like it, even though the athletics had mostly stopped. His hair was brown going gray at the sides, not dramatically. He had reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, which he seemed to have forgotten about. He looked at them both when they came in, and he looked at them the way the good ones did, actually looking, not performing attention. "Mr. Hawthorne," he said, and shook Adrian's hand. Then he looked at Vivian. "And you are?" "Vivian Sterling," she said. "I'm the reason we're here." He took his glasses off his forehead and set them on the desk. "All right," he said. "Sit down. Tell me." She talked for almost 2 hours. She'd told pieces of it before, to Calloway, to Adrian, but she'd never told all of it, in sequence, to someone who had the authority to act on it. The difference was significant in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. She'd rehearsed this in some form for 2 years, lying in various rooms in various towns, constructing and reconstructing the narrative. Now that she was doing it in front of a federal prosecutor who was leaning forward in his chair and asking quiet, precise questions, she found that the prepared version fell away quickly, and what came out instead was the actual thing. Not quite rehearsed, not always in perfect order, the edges rougher than she'd planned. Webb let her talk. He interrupted twice, once to ask for clarification on a date, once to ask her to repeat a name she'd said quickly. He wrote things down in a cramped, fast hand, not looking at the paper while he wrote it, keeping his eyes on her. When she reached the point where she'd left Denver, she opened the satchel and put the documents on the desk. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stack of papers. Then he picked up the first sheet. The next 20 minutes were the hardest part of the waiting she'd done in 2 years, because he read slowly and carefully and said nothing, and she sat across from him with her hands in her lap and watched his face, which gave almost nothing away except for 2 moments, once when his jaw tightened slightly, and once when he turned back 2 pages to reread something, and she saw briefly the controlled anger she'd heard described in Adrian's account of him. He set the papers down. "How many copies of these documents exist?" he asked. "These are the only copies. The originals are in Denver, assuming no one has destroyed them, which is possible. The originals would still be in the attorney's records? Or removed? I don't know what happened after I left." He looked at the papers again. "The names in here, 3 of them are territorial officials currently serving." "Yes." "That's why you couldn't go through local channels. That and the fact that at least 1 sheriff in 2 counties I passed through appeared to be working for people connected to this operation." He was quiet. He stood up and went to the window and looked out at the Helena Street, which was emptying of people in the early evening cold. He stood there for a moment with his hands behind his back. "I'm going to tell you something honestly," he said, still looking at the window. "What you've brought me is significant. If these documents are what they appear to be, and I'll need to verify them against public records and correspondence I can pull from federal archives, this is a case, a serious one. But these things move slowly, carefully. I'll need to issue subpoenas, work through the federal circuit court, potentially coordinate with the U.S. Marshal's office." He turned around. "Caldwell's people will know something has shifted. What happens at your ranch in the meantime is something I can't control from here. "I understand that," Vivian said. "I want to make sure you understand it in the specific sense, which is that I cannot offer you federal protection at Blackstone Ranch. Not immediately, Not until I've established enough of a formal record that I can justify the deployment of marshals. How long? Adrian asked. It was the first time he'd spoken in over an hour. If everything moves as quickly as it can move, 6 weeks, possibly 8. If there are complications with the subpoenas, or if Caldwell's attorneys are clever about delays, which I expect they will be, longer. He paused. I want to be useful to you. I don't want to be falsely reassuring. Vivian looked at the documents on his desk. Keep them safe, she said. That's what matters. They'll go into the federal evidence vault tonight. He looked at her steadily. What you've carried for 2 years will not disappear. She held his gaze and nodded. They stayed one night in Helena, a hotel near the court offices, 2 rooms, the first real beds they'd had in 3 days. Vivian lay in the strange warmth of an actual room with an actual mattress, and she felt the absence of the satchel against her ribs as a physical sensation, the way you feel the absence of weight you've carried so long your body has built around it. It was gone, in a vault, in the hands of someone with the authority to use it. She didn't feel the relief she'd expected. What she felt was something more complicated, a kind of groundlessness, as if the thing she'd been organizing herself around for 2 years had been the enemy but had also been the structure. Without it pressing against her ribs, she wasn't sure yet what shape she was. She slept anyway, deeply, without waking, which was unusual enough that she noticed it when she came back to consciousness in the pale morning light. The ride home was faster, 3 days out, 2.5 back. They pushed the horses harder on the return, not cruelly, but purposefully. The weather held, which was the one thing in their favor that nobody had earned. They didn't talk as much on the way back, not because things were worse between them. If anything, the opposite was true. The long ride out and the hours in Webb's office having produced a kind of settled ease that conversation didn't need to fill. She rode beside him and watched the landscape and thought about what came next, which was the practical problem now. What came next was returning to a ranch that Caldwell knew had moved against him, and waiting. She was familiar with waiting. She was less familiar with doing it from a fixed position with stakes this specific. They came back over the last ridge and saw the ranch in the late afternoon light, and she felt something move in her chest that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite fear. Something in between that didn't have a clean name. Calloway met them at the gate. He had the look of a man who had been managing things and managing himself simultaneously, which was a particular kind of exhausted. Glad you're back, he said, and meant it more than the words showed. Anything happen? Adrian asked, dismounting. Not to the property, but there's something you need to know. He glanced at Vivian, then back at Adrian. Sheriff Greer came out yesterday, from the county seat. Sheriff Greer was not the Silver Creek town marshal, whom they both knew slightly. He was the county-level official, which was a different weight entirely. He had a warrant, Calloway said, for Vivian. She was still on the horse. She felt the words land and felt everything that came with them. On what charge? Adrian's voice was controlled, but the control had gone hard. Theft and fraud. The warrant alleges she stole financial documents from a household in Denver 18 months ago and fled prosecution. Calloway's jaw was tight. I told him Miss Sterling was not on the property. He left the warrant and said he'd return. Vivian dismounted. Her legs were stiff, and she stood for a moment with her hand on the horse's flank, steadying herself, not from fear of falling, from the specific cold that came with understanding exactly what had just happened. Caldwell had moved faster than she'd expected, not with fire this time, with paper. Greer, she said. Is he? Straight, Calloway said before she finished. As far as I know, Greer himself is straight. But the warrant came from a judge in the county seat, and that judge... He paused. That judge has had dinner with Denton twice this month. Widow Farrar counts things like that. Adrian looked at Vivian. They manufactured a warrant. Of course they did, she said, flatly, because it was obvious in hindsight. The moment she took those documents to a federal prosecutor, Caldwell's attorneys would have begun preparing a counter-narrative. Theft, fraud, a disgruntled former household employee who'd stolen sensitive documents and invented claims to avoid prosecution. It was a clean story, simple to tell, hard to disprove quickly. What happens if Greer arrests you? Adrian asked. He takes me to the county seat. A county judge, possibly the one who issued the warrant, holds a hearing. I'm held pending trial or possibly pending extradition to Colorado if the Denver claim is treated as primary jurisdiction. She looked at Adrian. The documents are with Webb, but if I'm in county custody, I'm unavailable as a witness. And a criminal charge against me becomes part of the narrative. The documents I provided become the work of someone who is running from prosecution, not exposing wrongdoing. But it poisons your credibility, Adrian said. That's the idea. The silence in the yard was of the particular quality that comes when a problem reveals itself as larger than its visible surface. I need to send word to Webb tonight, Adrian said, looking at Calloway. Use the private line. Tonight. The land office will be closed. Parsons has a home. Wake him up. He was already moving toward the house. Vivian, come inside. I don't want you visible in the yard. She followed him in. Ethan was waiting in the kitchen. He'd positioned himself at the table with a book open in front of him, which was obviously a prop. The book was closed, actually, with his finger stuck in a page he hadn't been reading. He looked up when they came in, and he looked at them both with those careful gray eyes that caught everything. You're back, he said. We're back, Adrian said. Ethan looked at Vivian. She was still in her travel coat, still carrying the slight stiffness of 5 days on the road. He studied her in the way he had, not in politeness, just thoroughness, and she could see him cataloging what was different about her. The absence of the satchel, which he'd probably noticed her always carrying. The fact that she was wearing it on the inside of the coat on her way out, and didn't have it now. Did you do what you went to do? He asked. Yes, she said. He sat with that for a moment. Is it over? Not yet, she said. Not for a while, but the part that needed to happen happened. He looked at the table. His finger was still in the closed book. Sheriff Greer came, he said. Calloway told him you weren't here, but Greer said he'd come back. I know. Are they going to arrest you? She looked at this boy, this 11-year-old who had lost his parents and lived in a household held together by grief and routine, and who had spent the last 5 weeks coming to the kitchen every morning on the pretext of salt and stools, and who asked direct questions because nobody had ever given him a good reason not to. They're going to try, she said. We're going to make it difficult. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face shifted. Not reassurance exactly, but something that was the emotional precursor to it. The decision to extend provisional trust. Okay, he said, and went back to his not reading. But Adrian sent the message to Webb that night through Parsons, who was indeed unhappy about being woken, but who complied without argument, which Vivian suspected said something about what you could expect from people when Adrian Hawthorne asked them for something. The following morning, Adrian drove into Silver Creek himself, alone. Vivian stayed at the ranch per his instruction, which she'd argued about for approximately 10 minutes, and then accepted because she understood the logic. Her being visible in town while the warrant was active served no purpose, and gave Greer an easy opportunity. He came back in the early afternoon. She heard the wagon before she saw it, and was at the window before he came through the gate. He came into the kitchen and stood there and looked at her with an expression that was not good news but was not catastrophic either. I went to see Greer directly, he said, at the county office. She waited. I told him that the warrant had been obtained through a corrupted judicial process, that the judge who signed it has documented financial relationships with the firm that's trying to acquire Blackstone Ranch through fraud, and that I had turned over evidence to a federal prosecutor 3 days ago that would, in time, establish all of this with specificity. He paused. I also told him that if he arrested you on this warrant before the federal process completed, he would be remembered as either the man who helped cover up a land fraud conspiracy or the man who was simply used by one. That the difference, from a historical standpoint, would be minimal. She looked at him. How did he take that? Badly at first, then better. He took his coat off and hung it on the peg behind the door. He's a decent man. He doesn't fully understand what's happening, but he understands enough to know he doesn't want to be on the wrong side of it. He's agreed to hold service of the warrant pending federal verification of the judicial chain. That buys us time, not indefinitely. No, not indefinitely. He went to the stove and put the kettle on. I also went to see Denton. She looked at him sharply. I wanted him to know that I'd been to Helena, Adrian said. I wanted that to travel back to Caldwell. He was quiet for a moment, then turned. The look on Denton's face when I said it told me that they knew about Webb, but not specifically about us meeting with him. They knew I'd left the ranch. They didn't know the outcome. You gave them the outcome. I gave them the information that's already settled. The documents are with Webb. That can't be undone. Caldwell knowing it doesn't change it. It only changes how he responds. She thought about this. He'll fight harder. Yes, but fighting harder is different from winning. He poured the water into the pot. We went to Helena. We delivered the evidence. We came back. The warrant is paused. Webb is working. He turned and looked at her directly. We're ahead. Not by much, but we're ahead. She was at the counter and she was looking at him, and there was a quality to the moment that she recognized, the specific clarity that sometimes arrived after things had been very bad and were not yet resolved but had shifted in a direction that was, however tentatively, forward. She looked at her hands. The right one was still wrapped, the wound healing slowly in the dry winter air. She thought about the barn wall, about Greer's warrant, about 2.5 days through February cold with everything at stake pressed against her ribs. Adrian, she said, why did you come with me? To Helena. You could have told me about Webb, given me a horse, pointed me north. You didn't need to come. He looked at her for a moment. The kettle was steaming between them. You've been carrying this alone for 2 years, he said. I didn't think you should carry it alone anymore. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the ranch went about its afternoon, the hands working, the horses in the pasture, the mountains standing behind everything in the clear winter light, the ordinary machinery of a life that people were trying to preserve. Thank you, she said, simply, without performance. He poured the tea and slid 1 cup across to her and didn't make anything of it. Calloway says the barn reconstruction can start in the spring, he said. He wants to rebuild it larger. She picked up the cup. Her wrapped hand made the grip awkward. Larger seems right, she said. He nodded. They drank their tea, and the afternoon light came through the kitchen window, and somewhere above them, Ethan's footsteps crossed the floor of his room with the slightly lighter step of a boy who had, perhaps, exhaled. The waiting was its own kind of weather. It settled over Blackstone Ranch the way February settled over the Montana landscape. Not dramatic, not loud, just present in every direction you looked. And every morning you got up and went about the work of a day that might break one way or the other before it was done. Vivian had learned to live inside uncertainty over the past 2 years, but this was a different variety. Before, uncertainty had at least been mobile. She could move through it, change her coordinates, put miles between herself and whatever was closing in. Now she was fixed. The ranch was her position, and she was holding it, and there was nothing to do with the waiting except wake up each morning and make the coffee and keep going. She kept going. The days had a shape now that she'd built carefully over her weeks at Blackstone, and she held to that shape the way you hold to a railing in the dark, not because the railing is beautiful, but because it's there and it keeps you from going sideways. Breakfast before 6. Bread on Tuesdays and Fridays, the supply run on Thursdays, though she varied her route slightly now, a habit she'd maintained since understanding that Denton was still in Silver Creek, and that she had no way of knowing who else might be watching the road. The hands got their lunches. Ethan got his kitchen time. The stove got its daily cleaning. Normal things. She did them on purpose. Ethan had started coming to the kitchen earlier in the mornings. She didn't comment on this. He'd gone from arriving at 7:30 or 8 with his studied pretense of needing something specific to appearing at 6:45, 6:30, eventually just past 6 with a directness that had abandoned all pretense and seemed slightly embarrassed about that fact. He would come in, find himself something to do that was useful but not essential. He'd taken over the task of filling the wood box beside the stove without being asked, and they would work in the same space and talk when talking happened and be quiet when it didn't. One morning in the 3rd week after Helena, he came in and stood at the wood box for a moment without filling it and said, "Do you think you'll stay after this is over?" She was rolling out dough. She kept rolling it. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "That depends on a lot of things." "Like what?" "Like how it ends. Like whether there's still a place for me here." She paused. "Like whether I've earned it." He looked at the wood box. You fixed the oven hinge, he said. In the first week. Nobody asked you to. She glanced at him. And you called me Ethan from the start, he said. And you didn't make a big thing about it when I sat in here. You just let me sit. He picked up a piece of wood and set it in the box with more care than it required. That's not nothing. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. It's not. He filled the rest of the wood box and left for his morning, and she stood at the counter with the rolling pin in her hand and looked at the door he'd gone through and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a very long time, the particular tenderness of being witnessed by someone who doesn't have an agenda about what they see. Webb's first communication came 22 days after Helena, in the form of a letter delivered directly to the ranch rather than through the land office. A deliberate choice, she understood, that meant he was being careful about channels. Adrian read it in the study and came to the kitchen with it folded in his hand. He's confirmed 4 of the names in the documents against federal records, he said. 2 of the territorial officials have documented payments from shell companies he's traced back to Caldwell's firm. He's applied for the subpoenas. She set the spoon down. And the warrant? He's filed a formal objection to the county warrant with the federal circuit court on jurisdictional grounds. It doesn't dissolve the warrant immediately, but it puts a federal hold on execution. He paused. Greer got a copy. Calloway says Greer seemed relieved. Greer never wanted to arrest me, she said. He wanted the warrant to go away on its own. It's going in that direction. She picked the spoon back up. Her hands were steady. She noted this with something that wasn't quite pride but was adjacent to it. There's something else, Adrian said. He was looking at the letter rather than at her. Webb says 2 other ranchers from Wyoming and 1 from Colorado have come forward since word began moving through federal channels. People who lost their properties to operations consistent with what I've described. He's expanding the case. She was still. Others came forward. 3 so far. He thinks there may be more. She turned away from him slightly because she needed a moment that wasn't being watched. She looked at the wall above the stove. The ordinary wall of a working kitchen, slightly smoke-darkened above the range, a crack in the plaster near the upper corner that she'd noticed her first week and had been meaning to mention. She looked at it and thought about a woman she'd never met whose family had lost a ranch in Wyoming when she was young, who had grown up in a family taken apart by something they couldn't name. She thought about all the people who hadn't had a copy of the documents, who'd had nothing but their word against the machinery of men with money and reach and lawyers who knew exactly which judge to approach. Good, she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. Good. Adrian let her have the moment. He folded the letter and put it in his jacket pocket and said, I'll write back to Webb tonight, and left her to the kitchen. Caldwell made one more move. She supposed she should have expected it. The pattern had been establish offer, then threat, then fire. And now, with the federal machinery engaged, he had fewer options but more desperation. And desperation in men like Caldwell expressed itself through the remaining tools, money and law. He sent an attorney to the ranch. The man arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, alone, in a modest rig that was clearly chosen to look less significant than the man driving it. He had the precise, practiced manner of someone very comfortable in legal proceedings and less comfortable with everything outside them. He asked for Mr. Hawthorne. Adrian received him in the front sitting room. He sent Ethan to the kitchen, which Ethan complied with through the specific obedience of someone who intends to listen from the hall. Vivian stayed in the kitchen, but left the connecting door open a careful inch. The offer, filtered to her through the walls and the door, was more complex this time. Caldwell, through his attorney, was proposing what was described as a settlement. Vivian would recant the documents as forgeries produced in a personal grievance against her former employer, Blackstone Ranch, would receive a land use payment of significant size, and all pending legal matters would be resolved quietly. No arrest, no trial, no further disruption to the ranch's operations. She heard Adrian's response clearly because he didn't lower his voice for it. Tell Mr. Caldwell that the documents have been in federal custody for 3 weeks and have been corroborated against federal records by a circuit prosecutor. Tell him that 3 additional complainants have come forward in Wyoming and Colorado. Tell him that what he is describing as a settlement is, from where I'm standing, an attempt to interfere with the federal investigation, which I suspect Mr. Webb would find very interesting to know about. A pause. And tell him that the answer is no. It was no when he offered $250,000, and it's no now. The number was never the point. She heard the attorney's measured, professional response. Something about the inadvisability of this position, the complexity of federal proceedings, the uncertainty of outcomes. Then Adrian again. I'm comfortable with uncertainty. I've been running this ranch through uncertain conditions my entire adult life. Please leave. The rig left 20 minutes later. Vivian was at the stove when Adrian came into the kitchen. He looked tired, but not shaken. The tiredness of someone who'd been holding a line for weeks and was still holding it, not the tiredness of someone whose grip was slipping. You heard? He said. Most of it. He sat down at the table. This had become a thing he did now. Sat at the kitchen table rather than standing in the doorway. She'd noticed the shift without saying anything about it. The same way she'd noticed Ethan's earlier mornings. The small gravitational adjustments of people moving toward each other. This is almost done, he said. Not today, but soon. You don't know that. No, he agreed, but it feels like it. She turned from the stove and looked at him. He was sitting with his hands on the table, not performing calm, but actually somewhat calm, which she'd come to understand was a genuine feature of his character, that under pressure he steadied rather than escalated. She'd found this reliable and also occasionally maddening, in the way that steady people are sometimes maddening to people who are trying to stay steady themselves and finding it costs more effort. What does it feel like, she asked, when it's almost done? He thought about it seriously, because he didn't have the habit of answering questions that deserved thought with the first thing that came to him. Like the ranch before a hard winter, he said. When you've done the preparation, the hay's in, the equipment's checked, the weak fence lines are reinforced, the winter's still coming, it's still going to be what it's going to be, but you've done what can be done. There's a different quality to the waiting after that. She looked at him for a long moment, then she went back to the stove. I'm going to write to my brother, she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it. I haven't written in almost 2 years. I should write. You should, he said. I don't know what to say to him. Say you're in Montana. Say you're all right. Start there. She thought about this. That's very straightforward advice. It's a straightforward situation, he said. You're in Montana. You're all right. Those are both true. She stood at the stove and thought, yes, those are both true. For the first time in a long time, she could say both of those things without the second one being a performance. The arrest came on a Thursday. Not dramatically. This was the thing she hadn't prepared herself for, the sheer administrative quality of it. She'd half imagined something with more physical weight to it, given the weight of what had preceded it. Instead, what happened was that 3 U.S. Marshals arrived in Silver Creek on the morning stage, served warrants at the hotel where Denton was still staying and at the county courthouse where the compromised judge had his offices, and sent a 4th marshal with a county deputy on the road toward the private property south of town, where Vincent Caldwell had, at some point in the preceding weeks, taken up temporary residence. Calloway heard about it from the Kincaid brothers, who had a man in town that day. He came back to the ranch at midday and reported it in the kitchen where Vivian and Adrian and Ethan were all present, which wasn't by design. Ethan had simply been there and nobody sent him out. Denton's in federal custody, Calloway said. Judge Prentice, the one who signed the warrant on you, he's suspended pending investigation. 2 of his clerks were picked up this morning as well. He paused. Caldwell was taken on the South Road. Apparently he attempted to leave the territory this morning. The marshal's man caught him about 12 miles out. The kitchen was quiet. Ethan said, So it's over? Calloway looked at him. The arrest part is over, he said, with the particular care of an adult who'd decided to treat the boy as someone who could handle an accurate answer. The legal part takes longer. There'll be trials. It could be a year or more before it's fully resolved. But they're caught, Ethan said. They're caught. Ethan absorbed this with the particular composure of a child who's been through enough that good news lands carefully rather than exuberantly. He looked at Vivian. She looked back at him. Something passed between them that didn't need words. The quiet acknowledgement between 2 people who'd both been holding something difficult for a long time and were now, cautiously, setting it down. I need to start lunch, she said. I'll get the wood, Ethan said. He went to fill the box. She went to the stove. and Calloway stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, looking at the kitchen, the ordered counter, the labeled shelves, the fire going in the range, with the expression of a man who found the ordinary comforting in a way he wouldn't have been able to articulate, and was glad to be in the presence of it. Webb came to the ranch 6 weeks later. He arrived on a Wednesday, which was not a supply day and not any particular day. He came because he had things to report, and because, she suspected, he wanted to see with his own eyes that the people involved were intact. He had the manner of someone who took his responsibility to witnesses personally rather than institutionally, which was a distinction that mattered. He sat in the front sitting room with Adrian and Vivian and a pot of coffee, and he told them what the past 6 weeks had produced. The investigation had expanded to 4 territories. 17 individuals had been charged, including Caldwell, Denton, 3 county officials, 2 attorneys, and a federal land registrar in Wyoming, whose falsification of records had been the mechanism that made several of the property seizures legally executable. 11 ranch families who'd lost their properties were in the process of having those properties restored, a process involving legal reconstruction of fraudulent deed transfers that was, as Webb acknowledged without apology, complicated and slow, but was moving. Caldwell was being held without bail on the federal charges. His attorneys had filed 7 motions in the first 3 weeks, all of which had been denied. The weight of the documentation was, Webb said, considerable. The Denver documents, Vivian said. The originals. Recovered, Webb said. The attorney whose household you worked in, he attempted to destroy his records when the federal subpoenas went out. His clerk, who had not been informed of the nature of the operation and was considerably unhappy to discover it, had already made copies as a precaution. He paused. The clerk's name is Henry Marsh. No relation to your Marsh here. He's agreed to testify. She looked at the window. The Montana spring was beginning. Not warm yet. Not by any comfortable standard, but the hard, dead quality of February had eased, and there were days now when the light had something alive in it. 11 families, she said. 11 so far. We expect 2 more cases to resolve within the month. She was quiet. She'd been carrying those families in her head without knowing their names or their faces. The idea of them, the abstract weight of what had been taken from people she'd never met. Now they were 11. A number. Specific. Real. There's something else, Webb said. He was looking at her in the way of someone about to say something they wanted to get right. The warrant against you, the fraud and theft charges from the county, has been formally vacated. The judge who issued it has admitted under federal examination that the warrant was requested and its procedural basis constructed by Caldwell's legal team in response to learning you'd carried evidence to federal authorities. He paused. You have no criminal record. There's nothing pending. She heard this. She sat with it. It was a simple sentence. Practically speaking, it meant a specific and limited thing. She had known, rationally, that the warrant was fabricated. She had carried that knowledge with her for weeks without letting it hollow her out, which had cost something. But knowing a thing is fabricated is different from having a federal officer look you in the eye and say, "It's gone. It was never real. You're clear." "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out quiet, and she let it be quiet. Webb nodded. He drank his coffee. He was a man who understood when not to add to something. After he left, she walked out to the pasture fence and stood there for a while looking at the mountains. The sky was doing something complicated with clouds and light in the way that Montana spring skies did. Dramatic without quite committing to weather. The kind of sky that made you feel small in a way that was, depending on the day, either difficult or useful. She heard footsteps in the grass behind her, and then Adrian was standing beside her at the fence, looking at the same sky. They stood there without speaking for a while. "My wife used to stand out here," he said, eventually. "She said the mountains were the only thing big enough that you couldn't argue with them." She looked at the mountains. They were, she thought, exactly that. "What was her name?" she asked. She'd never asked before. She'd known to wait. "Catherine," he said. "She sounds like someone who said true things." "She said a great many true things," he said, "and some very inconvenient things, which usually also turned out to be true." He was quiet for a moment. He stopped and started again. "It's been 3 years. I know how that should feel at 3 years, and I know how it actually feels. And they're not always the same. She looked at the fence post her hand was resting on. What does it actually feel like? She asked. The same question she'd asked him in the kitchen about the waiting, asking because she genuinely wanted the real answer, not the version people gave when they were managing themselves in front of others. Like a room you've cleared out, he said, after a long moment. You've made it orderly. You know where everything is. And it's fine. It functions. And then sometimes you walk in and the light is different, and you think, there should be something here. Not exactly what was there before, but something. She was quiet. I'm not asking you anything, he said, carefully, because he was a careful man. I want to say that clearly. I know, she said, equally carefully. I'm not answering anything. All right. They stood at the fence in the spring wind with the mountains doing what the mountains did, and neither of them said anything for a while. And the not saying was its own kind of language that both of them, for different reasons, had learned to read. The north barn went up in May. Calloway had said larger and larger was what happened. The new structure was nearly a third bigger than the one that had burned, with better ventilation in the upper section and an improved door system that would make winter access easier for the hands. The Kincaid brothers came with their men to help raise it, which was the kind of gesture that doesn't get made in writing and doesn't get discussed in formal terms, but means exactly what it looks like. We were paying attention. We're here. The raising took 3 days. Vivian cooked for all of it, not just the Blackstone hands, but the Kincaid men and the 2 hands from the Dalton spread, who showed up on the second morning without being asked. She cooked on a scale that would have seemed impossible to the woman who'd stood in that kitchen on her first night, taking stock of a disorganized pantry and a stove that needed cleaning. She'd learned the kitchen by then the way you learn any important place, by the feel of it, by where the light fell, by what it could do when you asked it to do something. On the last day of the raising, when the final boards were up and the roof was on, and the men were standing back looking at what they'd made with the particular satisfaction of physical completion, Cody, the youngest hand whose eyebrows had grown back from the fire with no lasting evidence of the singeing, said something to Marsh that made the older man laugh, a real laugh, not his usual compressed acknowledgement. She watched this from the yard and thought, that's what recovered looks like. Not perfect, not unmarked, just still going. That evening, Ethan asked her to teach him to make bread. Not to watch, not to sit on the stool, to actually make it himself, from the beginning. She set him up at the counter with the flour and the water and the salt, and she stood beside him and talked him through it, and didn't correct him when he added the water too fast, just told him what to expect from dough that was too wet, and let him discover that the fix was more flour and patience rather than any great catastrophe. He worked the dough with the focused intensity he brought to everything, his small hands pressing into it with more force than necessary at first, and then, as she guided him, finding the actual feel of it. How do you know when it's right? He asked. It stops sticking to your hands and starts to feel smooth, and there's a sound to it. When you push and it springs back, you can hear it change. He worked it for another few minutes, listening. Then he looked up. It changed. It did. He looked at the dough with an expression she'd seen before. Something between accomplishment and surprise. The look of someone who has just made something work and isn't quite certain yet whether to believe it. Is it good bread? We'll know in an hour, she said. That's the other thing about bread. You do the work and then you wait. The waiting is part of it. He put it in the bowl to rise and covered it with the cloth, and she watched him do this with care, making sure the cloth covered the edges, setting it near but not too near the stove. All the small attentions that turned adequate bread into good bread. He did these things not because she'd told him to do each one, but because he'd been watching long enough to understand the principle behind them. This boy, she thought, this boy is going to be all right. Whooped. Adrian asked her to marry him in June on an ordinary morning in the kitchen. She knew it was coming in the way you know most important things. Gradually, then suddenly, the slow accumulation of evidence arriving at a moment where the conclusion was obvious, even if she hadn't said so to herself. She'd felt the shape of it in the way the winter had eased between them, in the conversations that had gradually become the kind you only have with someone you trust specifically, in the fact that she had stopped thinking about leaving and had started thinking about the spring garden. He came into the kitchen for his morning coffee, and she had it ready, and he took it and stood at the window for a moment, as he always did, and then he turned and said without preamble, "I'd like you to stay permanently as my wife, if you'd have it. I understand if that's not what you want. I'm not—" He stopped. He was not a man who rehearsed speeches, and this showed. "I'm not asking because the situation is resolved, and I'm not asking because of Ethan. Although Ethan would be— The point is, I'm asking because of you, because of who you are." He looked at the coffee cup. "That's probably insufficient as a proposal." She looked at him. This man who had refused $250,000 on her behalf, who had ridden 3 days through February into the cold and sat in a federal prosecutor's office and not made it about anything except what was right, who had told her, at a pasture fence in the first breath of spring, that he wasn't asking anything and had meant it and had waited. "It's not insufficient," she said. He looked up. "Yes," she said, plainly, without decoration. "I'll stay." Something crossed his face that was the closest she'd seen him come to the unguarded happiness of someone who'd stopped expecting good things and received one anyway. He didn't cross the kitchen and sweep her up in any grand gesture. He just looked at her and said, "All right," and the rightness of it was in the word itself, in the quiet, ordinary morning around it. Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway 30 seconds later, which meant he'd been in the hall. He looked at them both with those careful gray eyes and seemed to take a reading of the room. "Did something happen?" he asked. "Yes," Adrian said. Ethan looked at Vivian. "Are you staying?" "I'm staying." He nodded. His face did the thing it rarely did, cracked open, just briefly, into something open and young and unhidden. Then he composed himself with the dignity of an almost 12-year-old who wasn't going to cry in front of people. "Good," he said. "I need someone to teach me pie crust." She laughed. It came out real and full and slightly surprised her. "That's a high-difficulty lesson. You've only just managed bread." "I'm a fast learner," he said, and went to fill the wood box, which he'd been doing every morning for months without once being asked. They were married in August, at the ranch. Not a large ceremony. She hadn't wanted large, and Adrian had never been a man for ceremony in the formal sense. But large in the way that mattered. The ranch hands were there, and the Kincaid brothers and their families, and Widow Farrar, who had driven 43 miles because she said she'd known from the moment Vivian stepped off the stagecoach that something interesting was going to happen. Calloway stood next to Adrian, looking uncomfortable in his good jacket and profoundly pleased about everything. Ethan stood beside Vivian with the contained dignity of a boy who had decided this was the version of his life that was going to hold. Webb sent a letter. He was in Wyoming that week on related proceedings, which were ongoing. The trials were slow, as he'd said they would be, and justice in that specific legal sense was still being constructed carefully from the evidence that 2 years of running and one February ride had made possible. He wrote that Caldwell's trial was set for October. He wrote that 13 families now had their land back. He wrote that the clerk named Henry, who had made copies as a precaution and thereby corroborated everything, had been given a commendation by the federal attorney's office, which Webb noted with some satisfaction was the most that institution had managed to do right in recent memory. She read the letter twice. 13 families. She folded it and put it in the pocket of her dress and stood in the morning light on the day she was going to be married and thought about all the things that had to go exactly the way they did in order for this day to exist. A household in Denver where she'd paid attention when no one thought she was paying attention. A letter from a dead woman that took 4 months to arrive. A stagecoach arriving 40 minutes late into a frozen town. A ranch manager named Calloway who'd hired her because she asked directly and waited out the silence. A boy who'd come to sit on a stool, and a man who'd come to stand at a window, and an ordinary kitchen where a great deal had happened that kitchens don't usually witness. She didn't think of herself as brave. She'd never really thought of herself as brave. Bravery implied a choice between fear and action, and most of what she'd done over the past 2 years had felt less like choice and more like the only available option given who she was. You don't carry evidence of a crime for 2 years because you're brave. You carry it because you looked at it and understood what it meant and couldn't look away, and once you know a thing, you cannot unknow it, and so you carry it and you keep going. That's not courage in the clean sense. That's something more ordinary and more durable. The refusal to put down what you're holding just because it's heavy. The insistence on delivering it to someone who can use it, even when you don't know yet who that person is. She had found the person. She had delivered it. And the weight she'd organized herself around for 2 years was gone. And what remained? What was left when you stripped away the running and the fear and the tight, careful months of performing ordinary life, while extraordinary pressure pressed against everything, was a ranch in Montana. A man who told the truth and knew the difference between waiting for perfect conditions and waiting without purpose. A boy who was going to be fine. A kitchen that was hers. Not in the legal sense, not yet, though by the end of the day it would be, in the way that everything at Blackstone would be. But hers in the sense that already mattered. Hers because she'd learned every corner of it, had reorganized it from disorder into order, had fed 14 men and one growing boy and one grieving man through a Montana winter, until they'd all been, in their different ways, a little less hungry than they'd been before she came. The ceremony happened in the early afternoon when the light was good. Vivian wore a dress she'd made in the weeks preceding. Not elaborate, not a performance of occasion, but good fabric and careful work, the kind of thing that would last. Adrian wore his good suit, which fit him better than Calloway's jacket fit Calloway, and he stood beside her with that quality of stillness that she'd come to understand was not coldness, but depth. The stillness of someone who felt things fully and didn't need to display that to have it be true. When it was done, when the ordinary words had been said and the thing was settled, she looked out at the people who had come, hands who'd eaten her food for months, neighbors who'd helped raise the barn, a widow who'd driven 43 miles because she thought something interesting was going to happen. And she thought, this is what belonging looks like when you've built it instead of inherited it. It doesn't look like arriving somewhere and being received. It looks like staying long enough to become necessary, like showing up every morning and making the coffee and doing the work that needs doing until the work and the place and the people start to shape themselves around your presence and you around theirs, until the separation becomes difficult to trace. She'd carried a leather satchel through 2 years of cold and uncertainty and fear, and what was inside it had mattered, and it had done what it needed to do. But that wasn't the whole of what she'd carried. She'd also carried, without quite knowing it, the version of herself that knew how to pay attention, that knew how to wait without going hollow, that knew that feeding people, really feeding them, with care, with salt, with time, was not a small thing disguised as a small thing. It was a profound thing that had learned to look ordinary. The new barn stood at the north edge of the property, larger than the one that had burned, which was as it should be. The mountain stood behind everything, indifferent and permanent. The afternoon light did what August light did in Montana, which was to make everything it touched look like it had been there forever. Ethan appeared at her elbow during the gathering afterward, holding 2 plates of food with the careful concentration of someone transporting something breakable. He handed her one. I made the rolls, he said. She looked at them. You made them this morning? Before everyone was up, Calloway helped me fire the oven, but I did the rest. She took one and ate it. It was slightly uneven. One side had risen higher than the other, and the crust was a fraction darker than ideal on the bottom, and it was entirely, completely good. That's a real roll, she told him. That's the real thing. He stood beside her, eating his own roll with the expression of someone who has made something work and has decided to let himself feel good about it. They stood together and looked at the assembled people, the long table Calloway had set up in the yard, the light coming through the gap in the mountains to the west, at the exact angle that turned everything briefly gold. Vivian, Ethan said. Yes. I'm glad you got off that stagecoach. She looked at him. This boy who had stopped speaking to almost everyone, who had sat on a stool and learned the sound of a proper simmer and made bread and now rolls and was going to be unmistakably fine. So am I, she said, and she meant it in all the specific ways it was possible to mean it. The particular gratitude of someone who knows exactly what the alternatives were, who has seen the other roads clearly enough to understand what it cost to find this one, who does not take the ordinary, extraordinary miracle of a good place and the right people for granted, because she has carried too much and walked too far to ever mistake comfort for something that simply happens. It does not simply happen. You carry what you know. You keep going. You find the person who can do something with what you've been carrying, and you put it in their hands, and then you stay. In the place that finally earned your staying, with the people who are changed by your being there, for all the ordinary, extraordinary mornings that come after. That is the whole of it. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything.